Afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the third webinar in our Garden Problem Solving series, Nuisance Wildlife, with K-State Wildlife Specialist, Dr. Drew Ricketts. This program is brought to you by the Shawnee County Extension Master Gardeners, who serve as volunteers for K-State Research and Extension. As the first land grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, K-State acknowledges that the state of Kansas is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Potawatomi Band, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. K-State Research and Extension programs and materials are open to all, without regard for race, color, national origin, sex, gender, gender identity, religion, age, disability, political beliefs, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. Today's program, Nuisance Wildlife, will be taught by K-State Specialist Dr. Drew Ricketts. Please remain muted during Dr. Ricketts' program, but feel free to put any questions you may have over in our chat box. Your Shawnee County Extension Master Gardener, Kevin Seek, will help to moderate the chat. At the end of the program, we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A session with Dr. Ricketts. We will record today's session and post it on our website, so look for that email tomorrow morning along with a short post-programmatic survey. Our survey collects valuable feedback that help ensure we can continue to provide the same quality programs moving forward. We would appreciate you taking just a few minutes to complete that survey when you receive it tomorrow. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Drew Ricketts. Dr. Ricketts, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And let me start my screen sharing real quick. Okay, are we seeing what we need to be seeing?
Yes, sir, looks good.
Awesome. So as Leslie said, I'm Drew Ricketts. I'm the Extension Wildlife Specialist at K-State, and today I'm going to be talking about nuisance wildlife, which typically I refer to as wildlife damage management. And I give a lot of these talks around the state and do a lot of hands-on work with folks with wildlife damage management. One big focus area that I have is damage to agricultural production. So that might be coyotes killing calves, or deer damaging crops. But today, our focus is going to be on wildlife damage management in the lawn, the landscape, and of course, gardens. So there's a particular group of species that we'll talk about, but we'll get to that a little bit later. I'm going to have some background slides here at the beginning where we talk about sort of the history of wildlife damage management, and then the principles that we use basically for any wildlife damage issue. And then we'll get into sort of the last half of the presentation. We'll be looking at the signs that different wildlife leave and how to identify those signs to figure out which critter is causing the problem. And then we'll talk about the different options that we have to deal with that damage. So human wildlife conflicts basically have been occurring as long as there's been people, because as long as there have been people, we've been living in close contact with wildlife. If we look back to written history, we know that the Egyptians used cats to try and manage rodents that were depredating grain that they stored and food that they had and that sort of thing. Going back to 600 BC approximately, we can look to Aesop's fables And one of those stories in that collection of stories was about a crane that was depredating grain in a crop field, and somebody used a net to catch the crane. So we know that these things have been happening for thousands of years, as long as there's been people. Oftentimes, our most obvious response, or the thing that comes to mind the quickest for folks, is to get rid of that critter that's causing the problem. Let's remove them. And removing might mean we're killing them, or it might mean that we're collecting that animal and we're taking them somewhere else. Most of the time, folks are actually contributing to those problems that wildlife cause on their property, but that's not our first thought. We don't think about how maybe the fact that we feed our cat or our dog on the back porch and we leave that food out overnight is attracting a raccoon or a skunk or an opossum to our porch, and then that leads to a conflict. So that's a big part of my job, is helping folks understand how they might be contributing to a problem that they're having that recurs year after year after year. And so, sort of like I just alluded to, that damage or the wildlife conflict is going to keep recurring unless we address that root cause, like the food being left out overnight and that sort of thing. And, you know, a lot of times we talk about species being overabundant. So maybe we're talking about urban deer, or before we started recording, we were talking about house sparrows and starlings. And a lot of times overabundance is actually an indication of how adaptive, or the adaptability of that species of wildlife to the conditions that we create as humans. Many species that we like to hunt or observe, like whitetail deer, northern bobwhite quail, wild turkeys, were most likely at higher abundance during the last century than they were before Europeans settled the Great Plains, because those species are able to really thrive with the combination of habitat, food availability, and those sorts of things that were created under small scale farming in this big matrix of grassland and crops and those sorts of things. And those species that are highly adaptive do really, really well oftentimes in the conditions that we create. And so nuisance wildlife and wildlife damage is oftentimes dealing with these species that are really good at living around people and taking advantage of those resources that we create. So when we have to deal with the wildlife damage issue, there's 4 main principles that we use when approaching the problem. The first is to identify the critter that's responsible. So there are specific damage patterns. There are signs like tracks, scat, which is the fancy word for poop that wildlife biologists use. There are claw marks, bite marks, all these sorts of things that we can use to identify that species. The second is having a knowledge of wildlife biology and being able to relate that back to the management of damage. There are problems that I know are going to happen at certain times of the year with certain critters because of their natural history. So during the last couple of months, I've had a lot of calls from sheep producers about coyotes killing lambs, and goat producers as well. And that's occurring this time of year because they're lambing in the spring or producing kids in the spring. Those lambs and kids are still small right now, while coyotes are raising pups. And that's a high food demand time of year. And so we know that those sorts of things happen at different times of the year. So that's really important in thinking about how we manage that issue. Whoops. You have to know what your options are, or your management alternatives. And so along with that, there are lots of local, state, and federal laws that apply depending on which species we are, what location, or excuse me, which species we're dealing with, what our location is. So it's different if you're in town in Topeka versus right outside the city limits, our options are drastically different depending on what species we're dealing with. And the nice thing is that even though this is really complicated and there's lots of different species we have to worry about, there are lots of different laws and regulations that govern all of this. My predecessor, I don't know why, but I'm having an issue with skipping slides here for some reason, so bear with me on that. My predecessor put this website together, wildlife.kstate.edu. This is the Extension Wildlife Management page, and it's a resource for basically all things wildlife. So if you're having wildlife damage issues, you can go to this website. You can click on the link for bats or cottontail rabbits or coyotes or mice or moles, and you can get to the information sheets that have been put together for those species and how to deal with the problems that they're causing, also how to identify problems that they cause. And then there's also links to the regulatory requirements and all those sorts of things for all these different species. So that is a very, very good resource that has been put together, and I'm going to continue to maintain it and update it and that sort of thing. My contact info is also on this page. My phone number, my fax number, and then my email address are also here. So that's how you can find lots of information and also get a hold of me if you need to. So when I'm teaching my college class about how to deal with human wildlife conflicts, part of it is talking about the theory that we use to address human wildlife conflicts, talking about all the potential options, but then we also talk about the practical options. And in talks like these, typically I'm not going to focus on theory. I'm not going to focus on the options that usually aren't practical for folks to use. We're going to think about practical, usable options for dealing with human wildlife conflicts. So when we think about that, if you've got a problem, there's a critter causing a problem and you're trying to figure out how to deal with it, I want you to come back to this acronym over and over, HER. And the H in this acronym stands for habitat modification. So here we're talking about removing the food, cover, and water that are components of habitat for a species that are attracting them to a resource that you don't want them to damage and contributing to potentially that damage. One way that we can stop that damage sometimes is to alter the habitat that resource is a part of. So if we look at this example in this picture, we've got a barren crop field. And at that point in time, there's no cover out there. There's not food unless it's a species that can pick seeds out of the ground, and there's no water. So that's not very usable habitat for most wildlife species at the present. Exclusion is the E component of our acronym HER, and that just means using a fence or a repellent to keep a critter from getting to that resource. If we can stop an animal from getting to a resource, we can stop damage 100% of the time. Most methods of exclusion aren't 100% effective. But when we're thinking about terrestrial mammals, so things like raccoons, coyotes, deer, there are effective options for excluding. They might not be cost effective, but there are options out there for excluding species from accessing a resource. So here we can see a fence that's been set up around a garden to keep deer out, also to keep raccoons out and rabbits and those sorts of things. Our third option, the R in our equation, stands for removal. And that removal can be dead or it can be alive. So in this example, we had some beaver who were damaging trees and also building dams that caused flooding. So really the only option in that situation was to remove those beaver. We typically don't advocate for translocation or moving wildlife around. And I'll talk about why here in the next slide. So these beaver had to be removed dead. Okay, so wildlife translocation, that's the fancy term that we use when we're talking about catching a critter and taking it somewhere else. So there's lots of issues around wildlife translocation that may or may not make it useful depending on what your situation is. The reality is that most of the time folks don't move critters far enough in order to keep them from returning to the place that they were captured when we move them. Just some examples, mountain lions, you can move them 150 miles and some of them will still come back to the site of capture when we move them that far. We think about wolves, it's even farther. Typically, if we're thinking about a wildlife problem in the city, we're not talking about wolves and mountain lions. We might be talking about raccoons or opossums. A general guideline that wildlife removal contractors have to use is if they're trapping a critter and moving it to try and stop a damage issue, they have to move it at least 10 miles. Most people don't move raccoons 10 miles if they're trying to stop a damage issue. Also, new animals often replace those that are translocated. And so if we don't address that root cause, the thing that's attracting that critter to the spot where the resource is that's being damaged, then that damage is going to continue even if we trap and move a critter. Oftentimes as well, the critters that we're moving around have gotten used to capitalizing on the resources that we have that they're damaging. And when we move them somewhere else, they don't know where the natural food is. They don't know the area as well. And so they're more likely to seek out other human sources of food or shelter or those sorts of things and cause problems where we move them to. So there's a general conception that the most humane thing we can do with an animal that's causing a problem is to trap them and take them somewhere else and turn them loose so they can live happily ever after. But do they really live happily ever after? And unfortunately, the answer to that is typically not. So there's been a few studies, probably not enough, that have looked at survival and success of animals after we've trapped them to remove them when they're causing problems and taking them other places. One example is a study from 2004 where they were trapping gray squirrels in an urban area and taking them to a woodlot out in the country that had ideal habitat conditions and releasing them there. After a few months, only about 3% of the squirrels were still in the area and still alive. So this is probably an extreme example. There are other examples if we're thinking about raccoons. The typical number that I've seen in several studies is around 50% of them survive the first few months. If they're able to recapture animals that they've turned loose that survive past that point, many of them are emaciated. Others will have traveled many, many, many miles, much larger distances than a raccoon normally would, trying to get back home. And I guess the point of all of this is that even though it seems like the more humane option when we have to remove a critter to release it, you're actually most often dooming that animal to starving to death or to roaming around trying to find its home and being subject to death by predators, fighting with other animals, and lots of other things. So oftentimes euthanasia, which means we're providing a good death, which is sort of a weird thing to think about, but that's actually the more humane thing to do in many instances. Another thing we need to think about is what are the consequences of translocation? Something that most folks don't think about is anytime we're moving a critter, we're moving anything that's on the outside or the inside of that critter along with it. Lots of animals that cause wildlife damage harbor diseases that we don't really want to be moving around on the landscape. If we think about raccoons, they are a potential rabies vector. They're not a common rabies vector in our part of the country, but they can be. So you could be moving rabies on the landscape. They commonly are infected with canine distemper virus, leptospirosis. There's a roundworm called raccoon roundworm that doesn't really affect raccoons all that much, but can be lethal to humans. So there are much bigger consequences beyond, what happens to that specific animal that we might be trapping and moving around. Is it cost effective? And, if we're thinking about 1 or 2 raccoons that might be in somebody's yard or 1 or 2 squirrels, then it's probably not going to cost that much to trap them and move them 10, 15 miles. But if we're talking about a recurring problem that happens year after year after year, then it's typically not going to be cost effective. What's the government policy? So are you allowed to trap a critter that's causing a problem and move it somewhere else? The way that the regulations read is you have to have permission from the landowner where you're going to move it. The regulation for nuisance animal damage control operators, which are people who are legally allowed to do this when it's beyond their own property, is that they have to move it 10 miles. So what about public land? It's pretty common for folks that have a problem with, let's say, a squirrel, to trap that squirrel and then take it to a wildlife area that's owned by the state because that's public and turn it loose there. Those folks are actually breaking the law. You have to have permission from the state wildlife agency to do something like that. So you have to have permission. So let's think about lethal control or euthanasia, however you want to talk about it. Is it safe? The reality is that lethal control can be the safest way to deal with nuisance animals when habitat modification or exclusion efforts aren't practical. When we start talking about trapping critters and move them, if you're not really experienced with wildlife, you might be scratched or bitten by a critter in a trap. And that's not a good thing. That animal then needs to be euthanized and submitted for a rabies examination to determine if it's got rabies, because rabies is 100% lethal once you're symptomatic and you haven't gotten treatment. So you don't want to fool around with that. What are the ecological consequences? Are we going to affect population numbers of wildlife, or are we going to affect the integrity of an ecosystem by removing problem wildlife? The reality is that removing a few individuals that are causing problems generally doesn't affect ecological integrity unless we're talking about a threatened species, an endangered species, or something like that. In those situations, we're not allowed to use lethal control anyway. And so it wouldn't be allowed. What about the practicality of it? Lethal control, when we're thinking about how to deal with problem wildlife, is oftentimes the first step. So let's say you have raccoons that are getting into your attic and having young. Well, if you were to catch a mother raccoon and her kittens, most likely you wouldn't be able to catch them all at the same time. Those kittens can't survive on their own usually. So it's much more humane to euthanize those kittens to stop the problem. Okay, so we're going to remove the raccoons. And then we're going to patch the hole that they're getting into your attic into. So that would be exclusion. And so there's several steps in that process. So lethal control typically buys us time to implement other methods that don't involve killing wildlife. So we might have to kill a few in a humane way in order to stop the problem but that keeps us from having to euthanize a whole bunch over the long term. Is lethal control humane? If we're using lethal control to deal with the human wildlife conflict issue, then we should do our best to follow American Veterinary Medical Association guidelines for euthanasia. And so there are several methods that are approved, and these are the methods that would be allowed for a research project and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this. So one option is gunshot to the head. There's also thoracic compression that is accepted, and these sorts of things. And so if we're using these methods, then these methods have been approved by the AVMA guidelines as providing as humane of a death as possible to an animal that needs to die because of the situation. And that might be an animal that's being put to sleep, or it might be an animal that's causing a problem that we need to euthanize. What about the legality? So are we allowed to remove problem wildlife when they cause problems? So there's a state statute, 321002, that basically says if you have wildlife that are causing problems on your property, you're allowed to kill those animals unless they're protected by other regulations. So exclusions to this would be threatened or endangered species. In Kansas, we have a separate process for big game. So if you had deer damage, you could not shoot them and leave them lay without working through wildlife and parks and their deer damage process. And it also says that such landowners or legal occupants shall make reasonable efforts to alleviate their problems with such animals before killing them. Sometimes there's not any other options. Sometimes there's not another humane option, but sometimes there are. And like I said, sometimes euthanasia is part of this broader integrated approach where we're using several different methods to deal with the issue. So that was the end of my lecture, where we're looking at slides that don't have pictures and just talking about things. The rest of this, we're going to be working through specific problems and talking about different critters. So here's an eastern mole. Moles are insectivores. That means that they eat insects. So they're eating earthworms and grubs and arthropods that are in the soil out in your yard or in your garden. They've got several adaptations for living below the ground and being sort of this subterranean predator. And one of those are these big old paddle-shaped front feet with very large claws. And with those, they sort of swim through the dirt or the soil below the ground. They do this, and then they use their head. Their head's kind of like a bulldozer to push the soil up and make their burrows. The most common damage that they cause is their digging activity. So we see these runs or runways out in our yard, and then we see a molehill where they're pushing the soil up sometimes when they've been digging deeply to make their burrow system. Molehills are going to have a roundish base, like you can see here, and then they're going to be cone shaped. So they're going to come up to a point. And that's a good way to distinguish them from pocket gopher sign, which we'll see here in a little bit. So a common request that I get from folks that are reaching out to me for solutions to wildlife problems is there a poison I can put out? Because that is seen to be the quickest, easiest way to deal with the problem wildlife. Sometimes it's available. Most of the time it's not. In the case of moles, my predecessor, Charlie Lee, did a bunch of research on toxicants that are available for moles. And long story short, with this trial, he found a 14% decrease in mole activity in the yard after 21 days of treatment. So 14% efficacy is just, that's not acceptable. That's too low. And one of the main reasons is moles are predators. They're used to going after things that are moving in the soil. And there's not a bait delivery mechanism out there that can mimic a grub moving through the soil or a worm moving through the soil. And so you can fool some of the moles all the time, and you can fool all the moles some of the time, but you're never going to fool all the moles all the time. So you either need to learn how to trap them or learn to live with them. So I worked with Charlie on developing some videos for mole trapping. Those aren't done yet, but we do have some pictures that I pulled out from those to show you here. This first slide is about selecting a mole trap. There's a bunch of different mole trap options out there. They're all pretty good. When I was a kid, everybody had 2 or 3 of these hanging in their garage. These are called harpoon traps. Very common mole trap. They're very effective. There's a couple types here that actually go down below the soil in the burrow system. They can be very effective too. This trap, the black one, is called an out of sight mole trap. That's the trap that Charlie used the most often, my predecessor. And so that's what we're using for an example here. But the reality is that most of the traps can be very effective if you use them correctly. So when we're selecting a trap site, the first thing we want to do is go out in the yard or the garden and look at the mole runs. What we're looking for are these long, straighter sections that are unbranching of runway. These are the burrow systems that the moles are using to get from place to place in our yard. And they're typically going to be the spots that the moles come back through the most often. When we see lots and lots of branching, that's indicative of an area where the moles are feeding. They may never come back to that spot. And so if you set your traps there, you may not catch them. The next thing we're going to do is to use our finger or some sort of metal probe to poke a hole, a test hole in that runway. So we're just poking a hole in this ridge, and then the next day or two, we're going to come back. If that hole still looks like this top picture, it's open, that means that runway hasn't been used in the last 24 to 48 hours, or however long it's been since you poked the hole. If it looks like this, it's been replugged, that means that's an active burrow system, and that's a really good spot to set a trap because a mole is likely to come back through again sometime soon. So that's how we select our trapping site. Now that Charlie's found a trapping site where the mole replugged the test hole that he put out, he's going to use that out of sight mole trap as sort of a template. He's going to set it. He's going to straddle those jaws over the top of the burrow. And then he's going to use a masonry trowel to poke down through that burrow and make an area that's free for the jaws to open and close in. He's going to do that on both sides. Once he's done that, he's going to line up the trigger. So we see our out of sight mole trap that's set. This is our trigger here. He's going to figure out where that's going to be, and then he's going to use his thumb to make a depression on that ridge that the mole's been moving through. And that is where this trigger is going to sit. So when the mole comes back through, it's going to push up on that depression or that obstruction, and that's going to set the trap off. So then he's going to hold that trigger with his backhand and push directly down into those notches that he made with his masonry trowel until that trigger's resting on top of that depression. So then we have our completed set for trapping a mole right here. Are there questions in the chat?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So our next species may or may not be common in Shawnee County. They are common in the Flint Hills, but I know as I start getting over towards Ottawa and I give these sorts of presentations, folks don't have a clue what I'm talking about when I talk about the difference between pocket gophers and moles. Pocket gophers are a species of rodent that is highly adapted for living underneath the ground. They have big old molars. Their lips close behind their molars, or excuse me, incisors, not molars, so that those incisors are always exposed. And then they have external cheek pouches or pockets that they can shove vegetation back into after they clip it off. They also have these great big old claws for digging. And so those are adaptations for being below the soil and being able to bite off vegetation, shove it in here, and keep on it going while they're foraging, so that they are able to forage efficiently and then go back to sort of a resting place in their burrow system to eat that vegetation, so they're not getting a mouthful of soil every time they take a bite. A pocket gopher mound is very different looking than a mole hill, in that a pocket gopher mound is going to have a sort of a center plug right here. And this is actually where the burrow system is coming out, and the pocket gophers are kicking soil out of that hole, sometimes using their head like a bulldozer to push soil away from that central hole. And so the soil's in sort of an oblong splay out from that plug, whereas a molehill has a round base and it comes up to a peak because the moles are pushing that soil straight up. So that's a good way to identify them. They're very different from moles in that they're herbivores, and they feed on plants in 3 different ways. Sometimes they feed on roots while they're digging, like I mentioned. They also feed above ground near the burrow openings, and they tend to select green shoots and leaves of forbs or broadleaf plants. They'll also select rhizomes, or those above ground or lateral root systems. The last way is that sometimes they'll pull vegetation down into their burrow system from below. And again, they're selecting forbs and especially alfalfa and dandelions. So if we're thinking about our HER acronym, habitat modification is an option for pocket gophers. It wasn't for moles because we can't remove the food that moles select. There aren't any insecticides or pesticides that are labeled for earthworms, which is one of the main things that moles eat. There are herbicides that can remove the forbs, like dandelions in this picture, from a lawn or a landscape situation. So this side of this lawn is not good pocket gopher habitat. There are not forbs out there, which are their preferred forage species, whereas this side that's real weedy and has lots of forbs looks like a smorgasbord for a pocket gopher. So if we're thinking about lethal control, if you've got low to moderate numbers, we can use hand baiting, meaning using a toxicant that can be very effective for pocket gophers. We can also use trapping, and trapping can be a standalone method or it can be a follow-up to hand baiting. Fumigation is typically not going to be effective, and this is where we're putting a gas or like a smoke bomb down into a pocket gopher system, because they've got a really complicated burrow system. It's thought that they're able to really quickly plug off sections of burrow to isolate themselves from that fumigant that you're putting down in there and that sort of thing. So one study that Charlie did when he was testing some pocket gopher bait, he found almost 90% efficacy with one baiting at this rate for pocket gophers. And here, we're finding these mounds. We're using a steel rod basically to push down through the soil, find these main burrow systems, and then we're using a steel pipe that's got a sharpened end basically to push down into that burrow system and apply this bait below ground where nothing else can get to it. And so that's a very selective way to remove pocket gophers with a toxicant. I also indicated that we can trap them. Typically, when we're trapping pocket gophers, there's a couple ways we can do it. The way to catch the most of them the quickest is, again, to use that metal probe, stick it down through the ground, and find these main tunnel systems. Then we're going to dig a hole down to that tunnel. Pocket gopher traps are directional, so we have to stick one going this way and one going this way in that tunnel so that we can catch them coming and going. It's very important to wire these off so that when you catch a pocket gopher, they don't leave with your trap. But we can also catch them in those lateral burrows where they're excavating soil out to those mounds as well. But like I said, it's much more efficient to trap them in those main tunnel systems. So real quick in the chat, which one of these was made by a mole? A or B? I've got 1A and 2Bs. Do we only have 3 people that are brave enough to answer? Another B. So if you think back to the slide where I talked about each of these, we said that a pocket gopher will push the soil out or kick it out of the hole, and it's going to sort of fan out and make an oblong shape away from that center plug. Whereas a molehill is going to have a round base with a peak, because the moles are pushing that soil up from the bottom, and they push it up and they push it up, and so it comes out and it falls to the sides. And so the folks that said that B was the molehill are correct. So this is the molehill, and this is the pocket gopher mound. All right, so another species of critter that sort of partially lives underground and partially spends a lot of time above ground is the prairie vole. So prairie voles live in colonies. The entrances to those colonies are typically going to be like quarter to golf ball size holes. There's oftentimes several of those holes, and it's not necessarily this pronounced all the time, but you can often see trail systems that lead to those holes as well. So pocket gophers are a common species of wild rodent. Prairie voles are a common species of wild rodent. They have relatively small eyes, not super small like a mole's where we couldn't hardly see them, but relatively small eyes. Their ears barely stick out past their fur. They're sort of torpedo shaped. I like to say they've got kind of a blunt face and a blunt back end. They don't have a real pointy nose, and they've got a relatively short tail. Their tail is going to be less than a third of their body length, typically. They're herbivores, and so they're going to cut grass and eat basically hay, or cut forbs and make hay out of those forbs as well. And forbs are actually what they will select if they have the choice. Typically, when they become a problem in a homeowner type situation is when they become very high in abundance. They're cyclic, and so right now we're really near the peak of their cycle. So they're very high in abundance in a lot of places. They might be out in your yard. Typically this time of year, they're not really causing much damage. They're just out there eating grass, eating a few forbs, not really causing that big of a problem. But then come wintertime, if we get lots of snow cover that lasts very long, then they will be still doing their thing underneath the snow. And when they do that, they're cutting hay and foraging along these trail systems that they have just above the soil, and they're clipping that grass, and they can make very large bare patches out in the yard. And that's typically when they become a problem species. So they typically select areas with dense cover, and that's usually going to be dense grass, or if we're always discharging our hay into a pile when we mow, or like a ridge row or something like that, then they might select that sort of cover. So if we're thinking about habitat modification, one thing that we can do is to keep vegetation mode relatively short in areas where we're worried about voles. Also, don't allow hay to accumulate around important plants. There are situations sometimes where we have vineyards or orchards, and when we mow and always blow the hay or discharge that hay towards those high quality or important plants that we're needing to protect, then we're attracting voles to those locations. You can trap voles. They can be trapped with regular old snap traps like you might buy to trap mice in your house. Sticky traps also can work. And there's also several toxicants that are available for trapping or for removing voles as well. Most of the really effective ones are going to be restricted use because it's much harder to keep other things from accessing those baits than it is something that's isolated in the ground like a pocket gopher bait. Rabbits and hares can also be a problem in lawns and landscapes. So typically, Shawnee County, you probably mostly see eastern cottontails. Maybe every once in a while, you might see a black-tailed jackrabbit. Historically, jackrabbits would have been relatively abundant there, though. So when we're identifying rabbit damage, there's a couple things to look at. If a plant has been bitten off, you're going to be looking for these diagonally shaped bites. So it's going to be pointy and it's going to be bitten off at a diagonal, like you can see here. When during the winter time, when they start selecting woody vegetation, then they're much more likely to grab that bark and strip it off. So you're going to see stripped off bark or bark that's been pulled off in strips rather than nice clean bites on the bark. So during the winter time, especially out west, this is the sort of thing that we can start seeing when we have snow cover, especially for longer periods of time, and the vegetation is not available, the herbaceous vegetation is not available, and the rabbits start attacking woody plants. Exclusion can work very well for keeping rabbits away or keeping them from damaging specific plants. So we can use cages like this chicken wire cage to protect a tree. We can also add screen or hardware cloth to other types of fences to keep them out of our yard. We can also use frightening devices to repel them. So this is a motion activated sprinkler, which can work very well for rabbits. And our natural predators that we also use as pets are also pretty good at scaring rabbits off when they become a problem in the yard. There are some repellents that can be effective against rabbits. So this is an example of a trial where we had the Connecticut Ag Research Station, very, very, very high densities of rabbits. And they had a fence control that they compared to different rabbit repellents or repellents that were labeled for use against rabbits. And we can see that some of them were nearly as effective as the fenced control, and some of them were very, very ineffective. So the point is, sometimes repellents work, sometimes they don't, and they almost all don't work for a really long period of time. You can also use removal. A totally enclosed wooden trap like this is much more effective for rabbits than a cage type trap like this. They're just much more comfortable going into tight closed spaces than they are into a cage. All right, another bigger critter, whitetail deer. So in another month or so, we're going to start seeing this activity where the bucks their antlers have stopped growing, their hormones have shifted, and they need to remove that velvet from their antlers, and they start rubbing that off on woody plants. When they do that to sumac out in the pasture, it's not a problem. When they do that to my mom's smoke tree that Dad gave her as an anniversary present, it's a big problem because they killed this very high value tree. So we can use things like tree guards to protect against that sort of damage, and you'll see those in a few minutes. They also cause damage by eating things that we don't want them to eat. So they will nip off corn plants when they're actively growing and they are producing silks. So you can see what that might look like. They also are browsers. So they eat the leaves and twigs and new growth on woody plants and forbs. And that's what that looks like. They can be very devastating to landscape plants sometimes. So here's our extension forester, Charlie Barden. And one of the things he found early in his career was that tree guards are really, really effective at allowing young trees to grow up and get past the point where deer browse really affects them. So those can be very effective. We can also exclude deer using several different fencing options. This woven or net electric fence works pretty well. We can also use a 3D fence where we have one wire out here and a couple wires here that creates an optical illusion. So the deer don't realize that they can jump across that whole thing. And when they get shocked out here, that spooks them. Now, this is an example of a little more elaborate, a little more permanent 3D fence where we're using more permanent materials, and we're also using some apple scent and some aluminum foil on a tag on this fence to get the deer to go ahead and lick that and get a really good shock. So we're teaching them that that fence is bad. And this can be made for as little as 42 cents a foot, which is still pretty expensive, but is much cheaper than some of the other options. A more permanent option, if we're protecting a high value crop from deer, might be a high tensile electric fence like this. So here are some examples of different fencing options for deer and how effective they are and how much they cost. So if we're thinking about keeping deer off of an airport runway where people might die, then we're willing to spend that $20 per meter to keep deer almost 100% off of that runway. But if we're thinking about, keeping deer out of our sweet corn patch in our garden, then we might be happy with keeping 80 to 90% of the deer out and spending 42 cents or at least less than $2 per meter to exclude the deer. So the point of this is that there are lots of different options. Some of them are practical for some situations and some of them aren't. And how practical they are depends on what you're trying to protect. There's also commercial deer repellents. So here we're comparing a tree guard here in this teal color and an untreated control in red to a bunch of different repellents. The point is that some of them work as well for as long as the tree guards do. Others are no better than the untreated control. So some of them work really well, some of them work really poorly. And another main point is that plant skid, this green one right here, works pretty well for deer. And it was also the top performer in the rabbit trial that we saw. So for short-term issues in an isolated situation, like keeping deer from browsing a high-value plant in your yard or keeping rabbits from eating a high-value plant in your yard, that plant skid might be a good option. Okay, so here we have some more damage to corn. We see we've got some ears that are stripped down and they've been eaten, and it looks about like a person ate the corn off that plant. We've also got a whole bunch of plants that have been knocked down. Here, the same animal is digging up grubs in a yard, and it looks like pretty well the yard got plowed up. Does anybody know what critter we're looking at here? Yeah, this is raccoon damage. So raccoons can cause lots of different damage. They are extremely strong. They're very intelligent. Their front paws are very dexterous. And so they can grab things like a shingle or a rotten piece of wood on a roof and pull it back and break it to be able to access stuff. These critters probably cause more damage around homes and in urban areas than most other critters if we're thinking about a common species of wildlife. And the damage that they cause can be really diverse. They like the resources that we have out there for them. So if we're thinking about ways to deal with raccoon damage, they can be excluded. They like to get into dumpsters. They like to get into our trash. When they find those resources, they're going to keep coming back and keep coming back. So fixing garbage container lids is really important. So that's a form of habitat modification and exclusion. We're keeping them out of it, and we're also making that resource no longer available. Another habitat modification would be to remove food sources. Like I mentioned at the beginning, one way that folks oftentimes contribute to problems with raccoons and skunks and opossums is by feeding pets free choice 24 hours a day in their yard. So this is attracting those critters, and then they end up getting in fights with pets and those sorts of things. Trap and euthanize. I don't recommend moving raccoons around because of all the different diseases that they can carry. It's also typically more humane to euthanize them than to doom them to a long, slow death when we move them. One nice thing is that raccoons are easily trapped in cage type traps, whereas some other species that we deal with aren't. So that's typically the best option in a lawn and landscape sort of situation. Skunks are another problem animal that's really common in Kansas. So this is a striped skunk. Striped skunks are named for this stripe that runs from their forehead down to their nose. If you have a problem with striped skunks, you're free to take care of that problem. This, on the other hand, is a spotted skunk, which is named for this spot on its forehead. Spotted skunks are protected. And in Kansas, they're protected. Currently, they're not federally protected. So if you had a problem with a spotted skunk in your yard, you would need to call the local wildlife authorities, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, to get help with the issue, because this critter would need to be trapped and relocated in a way that helped ensure its survival, which would be what we would call like a soft release, where we gave it food and water and gradually released it in a spot with good habitat over time. So skunks are easy to recognize. A really good way to stop problems with skunks, again, is to reduce food sources. So bring your cat food or your dog food in at night. Try to use types of bird feeders that don't have as much spillage and that sort of thing. We can exclude them. So lots and lots of problems with skunks are very avoidable. Skunks are going to get under buildings, whether that's your house or a shed that has crawl spaces that are open, or let's say you have a shed that's up on skids and that sort of thing. They're going to take advantage of that as cover and spend time under those places. When that happens, it's pretty common for them to get in a fight with somebody and spray. And then that's going to be a conflict typically with folks, especially when it happens under a house. And so if we can plug up those openings and keep them from getting under those spots, then we can stop those issues. Skunks are our most common reservoir and vector of rabies in Kansas. So if you have a problem with the skunk, you need to euthanize that animal. You do not move it around, because you could be moving rabies around on the landscape or potentially exposing yourself to rabies. If you do have a skunk that sprays, here is an easy to make odor neutralizing solution. So we would take 1 quart of 3% hydrogen peroxide, a 1/4 cup of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of liquid soap. Mix this all in a non-glass container, because we don't want the peroxide and the baking soda to produce gases that cause it to expand and then explode in a glass container. You're going to mix this in a non-glass container, thoroughly wet down the area that's been contaminated, and rinse it with water. And this is something that's not going to be storable. Also, when we're trapping skunks, an enclosed trap that they can't see out of, like the trap on the left, is much better to use than this open cage type trap that we can see on the right. If a skunk can't see you, they don't perceive you as an immediate threat, and they're much less likely to spray. if a skunk can see you, they're much more likely to spray. So I like to use these Durapoly plastic traps because if I have a skunk in that trap, I can walk slowly up to it, be quiet, pick that trap with the skunk in it up, put it in the back of my pickup, and then take it somewhere to euthanize it where it doesn't matter if it sprays. I can do the same thing with a cage trap by carrying a tarp or a blanket in front of me, walking very slowly, observing the skunk's behavior to make sure I don't get it excited, lay that tarp or blanket over the trap, and then move it. But it's much more time consuming and more difficult to do if I'm having to use that tarp. Our last critter that we're going to talk about today is armadillos. Armadillos are very omnivorous. They eat lots of different plant and animal matter. Typically, when they're causing damage, we're seeing this digging, where they're digging after grubs and earthworms and that sort of thing that are down in the soil. So they've been moving north over the last 20 to 30 years. They were very uncommon in Kansas 25 years ago. Now they've become extremely common, especially in southern Kansas. They're as far north as Nebraska now. Like I said, they're omnivores, and most of their digging is due to feeding on grubs, earthworms, and arthropods. You can trap them in cages. You can try earthworms or rotten fruit as bait, but it's typically not all that effective. The most effective way to trap them is going to be to use drift fence to funnel them into a trap, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, or to use a scented wooden box trap, or to shoot them. They are active during the daytime a fair bit, and so if you're outside of the city limits in an area where it's safe to use a firearm, you can effectively control them through shooting. So just some more examples of how extreme the damage can be. And then here you can see my predecessor, Charlie, setting up a trapping array for armadillos, where we have this drift fence in between two traps. We're also using this building for a drift fence. Basically, the armadillo hits that fence, goes one way or the other, and on either end that it gets to, it's going to be funneled into a trap. And then here are these scented wooden armadillo traps that you can get from the armadillotrap.com. Basically, it's a box trap that they have put a live armadillo in. It has added its scent to that trap, and that will attract other armadillos to it. Much more effective in trials than wire cages when used without drift fence, but they aren't cheap, about $190 a piece. So that's an option as well. So when we're resolving human-wildlife conflicts, there's several things we can do. We can alter the attitude or perception through education, typically. Increasing acceptance of wildlife and the damage that they cause is a lot of what I do. We can alter the situation through habitat modification. We can exclude the critter using fencing or netting. We can scare the critter with sight and sound. We can repel them with taste, smell, or feel, which I talked about much less today. Or we can remove the critter, and that's going to be dead or alive. So remember that acronym, HER, habitat modification, exclusion, and removal. So with that, I'll take any questions, and there's my contact information.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ricketts.
Yeah.
What is this picture? It's a coyote.
Yeah. I think we underestimate maybe how effective our fences are sometimes when we're dealing with wily critters like coyotes. This is just a picture I found on Facebook at one point in time.
It's so funny. All of your pictures were so lovely.
Good.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Ricketts while we have him here? We didn't have any questions in the chat during your presentation, but
okay.
I was looking at the your website with the the wildlife kstate.edu, and it listed prairie dogs as kind of a pest. And I was just curious, are they not endangered here in Kansas, or?
No, they're not. They're actually they're a native species, but by state statute, they're managed the same as a musk thistle. They are classified as like a noxious weed in our state. And you know, most of that is because of the competition for forage with cattle. They're still very abundant in parts of western Kansas, but they actually are afforded no protections at all in Kansas unless they are in the very small black-footed ferret reintroduction site, and then it becomes very complicated to control prairie dogs without affecting the ferrets. So that would be the one small area that they are protected in some ways.
Oh, that's shocking to me. Everything that I have read or heard about it, it's been really difficult to have any numbers on population to understand what their actual decline has been. But they are regarded as a keystone species.
Yep. They're a really neat critter. They historically were very, very important, especially to the western prairies. They probably weren't very common in tallgrass prairie, but once you got west of the tallgrass prairies, they were, you know, millions of them, millions of acres of black-tailed prairie dogs historically. But we are an ag production state, and so a lot of our laws are established to support agricultural production. And this is an example where ag production trumps the keystone species.
Oh, I have a question from Donna. Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead.
A question from Donna. She's asking, is bone meal effective to repel rabbits?
Well, you know, I think if we go back, let me see if I can go back to that rabbit slide. There may be bone meal as an example on there, and so I might be able to show you some numbers. Okay, bonide, I believe, would be a bone meal based repellent.
Yeah, it is.
And it is one of the poorer performing repellents that they used. There's two options of bonide. One is the poorest, and one is a little more than halfway down the list. The plant skid it's putrefied pork blood that's been dried and turned into a powder, and that tends to work pretty well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that repellents that I've used, the ones that have blood meal in them, seem to work the best. But of course, like you said, they're very temporary, especially if you have a rain, you absolutely have to go out and replenish the, reapply, or you've lost all your effectiveness.
For sure. Yeah, even the most effective repellent can't do its job if it's been washed away.
But the blood meal and bone meal is a good soil amendment if you're putting it around your bulb garden. So, Yeah. I mean, you have that positive side, I guess, whether it's getting rid of all the rabbits or not.
Yep. And I see a link to the grub management article, and I assume that's sort of thinking about, skunks and raccoons and armadillos digging after those things. And
right.
It's kind of like I said when I was talking about moles. We can get rid of a lot of the grubs, but we can't get rid of earthworms. And those you can potentially reduce activity by some of these digging mammals by reducing grubs, but you're probably not going to eliminate them that way, because there's still going to be earthworms probably cicada larvae and all these sorts of things out there as well. So that it can help, but it's probably not going to be a solution.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Ricketts for your time. Your presentation was just fascinating. We would love to have you back anytime and hear your take on the other scope of things.
Sure.
Perhaps wildlife maintenance.
Yeah. Yep. I do all kinds of wildlife management, not just damage. So I appreciate you having me, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Please join us next Tuesday at 2 for the 4th and final presentation of our garden problem solving series. It's going to be fall lawn care with Sedgwick County Horticulture Agent Matt McKernan. So we'll see you then, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.